Welcome back to Connect and Transform. This is the next video in the series where we're creating a checkers game in an SVG. In the last video, we saw how to use URL parameters to affect data inside the SVG, allowing some communication between the SVG and its parent embedding document, if there is one. In this video, we're going to focus on some of the core game logic. So in an earlier video, we had created some scaffolding around some possible function names, and they're all still here. I've reordered a few, I've renamed a few to be slightly more consistent or slightly more generic. And I think in this video, we're going to focus mainly on the first few, probably these first 7 or so functions. So if we're getting a piece from a board square, either an ID or a location, let's say that we're passing it an ID. Let's scroll down real quick and remind ourselves of what the ID for a board square is. So in the generate board function, we're setting the ID attribute to be the constant b underscore, and then the x coordinate, which will be 0 through 7 inclusive, and then an underscore, and then the y coordinate also 0 through 7. So because the size of the board is not exceeding 9, we know the length of x is always going to be 1, the length of y is always going to be 1, and therefore the length of a board ID is always going to be 5. So that will help us. Likewise, if I scroll down again, the piece generation function, when we're setting the ID, whether it's red or black, it always starts with p underscore and then the same single character underscore single character for coordinates. It does have some additional data afterward, but it starts in the same format as the board piece, so we'll be able to make use of that. So let's assume that we're going to just pass an ID to these rather than the actual element to start with. We could always change it later, so we could pass an element, and then in the function, we could access the ID if that's how we choose to get the information. For these two, when we're checking if a board square is present at a location, then the operative word there is location. So the parameter that we're going to pass is probably going to be an x and a y, and an x and a y. Getting the team from a piece, that's probably going to be an ID because the piece is the thing that we're going to pass into the function. Same here, if we're checking if two pieces are allies, there's probably going to be ID1 and ID2. Whether a piece is kinged, we'll probably pass in an ID. And I think that's as far as we're going to get today. We'll just focus on these 7 functions. So for this one, because we know the structure of the board square ID that we're passing in is basically the same as the piece ID for the first few characters, it should be pretty straightforward. So I think it'll just be return document.query selector. And then we're going to say where the ID begins with. So we're getting a piece from a board square. So we're trying to query the piece. So that would be p underscore. And then we're going to have our x value. I'm just going to put x in there. I know we haven't defined that yet. Then there's an underscore. And then a y, which again, we have not defined. So we need to get our x and y values. And so I think the way we're going to do that, actually, because the structure is the same, we're just going to take a substring of the ID that we passed in. So we're going to skip the first 2 characters, and we want to grab the next 3. So I think that will do it. And then I think it's just a single line, and it'll be very similar for the next function. So we're passing in an ID that is a piece, and we're trying to return the board square. So that will just be b underscore, and then the rest of that will remain true. Okay, so I think those two functions are done. And then for this function, checking whether a board square is present at a given x and y location. So yeah, we're going to have a query. And then basically we're going to return true or false. So I'm going to call it board square. Okay, so we're going to have some query selector. So what is that selector going to be? Well, it's probably going to be by ID. And we're querying for a board. So we're going to start with b underscore. And then I think we're going to use, well, okay, we don't have an ID that we've passed in. We have x and y. So then we're going to say plus x plus underscore plus y. And in the case of a board square, this is the entire ID. There is nothing else after it. So that's convenient. So I think that piece is now done. I'm going to copy this for the next function. Now here, we're going to say if the board square exists, then we're going to return true. Otherwise, we're going to return false. There is one other thing we should probably be checking here. We should probably be checking that the board tile is a dark tile, because if you look over at the left of the screen, it's only valid for a piece to be on a dark tile. So when we're checking whether or not a board square exists, it doesn't really matter to us if a light board square exists, because we're never going to move there. It's never going to be under consideration. So not only are we going to check if the board square exists, we are also going to enforce that the board square's class list must contain dark. Now let's go verify that we're setting this. And we are, yeah. So when we're generating the board, we're setting the class attribute, and we're assigning either a dark or a light class. So that's already in place. So this is done. Okay, so I'm going to copy this entire function body for this one down here. And I think what we're going to have to do, because the pieces ID is slightly different, where it has either red or black at the end of it, not only are we going to change the prefix there, but then we're going to have to basically hard code in either black at the end or red at the end. Okay, and this is black piece, red piece. And so what this is doing is, this is basically querying, is there a black piece at that location, and is there a red piece at that location? And so now we're going to do something very similar. We're going to ensure that, for example, the black piece must exist. And then I think that's it. We could go query for class names. So for example, a black piece is given class names of piece and black, and a red piece is given class names of red and piece. But I think based on the fact that we're querying the entire ID, if it exists, it is a piece. So we're not going to overcomplicate that logic. And I think in this case, rather than returning true and false, we're either going to return the piece, or we're going to return false. Okay, so if the black piece exists, we'll return that. If the red piece exists otherwise in the same place, then we'll return that. And there should only ever be one of these or zero of these cases true. And if zero of them are true, then we'll just return false. Okay, so moving forward, getting the team from the piece. Well, we just saw here that the team is at the end of the ID. So what are we given? We're given an ID. So I think here it's going to be as simple as if id.index of. Now I'm wondering if I should actually make sure that the piece exists, but I think for the purpose of this function, we will assume that we're being given a proper ID. So if and now I'm wondering, should I make it fancier and check the class list? Because we are assigning red and black to the class list, but I think I'm just going to keep it simple. And if we scroll down here, when we're creating the pieces, okay, it is lowercase. Okay, so I need to make sure that these are lowercase. And then same here, lowercase. Okay, so if the ID contains black, and I guess I'll just stick with the lowercase. Otherwise, if it contains red, we'll return red. Otherwise, maybe we just return the empty string. Okay, checking whether two pieces are allies. Well, that's going to be very similar to the last one. So in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste that to start with. So if ID1 contains black and ID2 contains black, then we're going to return true because they are allies. Otherwise, if they each contain red, we will also return true because they are allies. Otherwise, we will return false. Okay, now checking for whether a piece is kinged. If you remember back to the very first video, maybe the second video, we created these radial gradients. And you'll notice that the word king is in the radial gradient, and the king is in here, and the king is in this ID. And you'll recall also it's the href that references this. So the href of the actual piece is going to reference one of these four values, either red piece, black piece, red piece kinged, or black piece kinged. Kinged being capitalized. So to finish this, we're basically going to query for the piece based on the ID, and then we're going to get the href attribute and check for whether or not the href attribute contains kinged. Okay, so we're getting our piece by query, and then we'll say if for good measure, we'll just make sure the piece exists. If the piece exists and piece dot get attribute href dot index of king does not equal -1. So this is basically just saying if the piece exists and the piece has an attribute called href that contains king, then we are going to return true. Otherwise, we are going to return false. And that's that. So we've begun a large portion of our helper logic. Let me just refresh the page here. Okay, I've refreshed. There's no JavaScript errors. So at least in terms of static syntax, things are not broken. But we've coded quite a bit. We still have a lot to go, especially around like moves and positioning. All of these things have to do with moves and positioning. This is going to involve some animations, as is some of these, which is why I grouped them close together. Heuristic and strategy will probably be more complicated. Some of these will be more simple, updating information. That's just going to be querying some elements and probably using global variables to update the value. But we've got a lot of the logic done. I think that'll do it for this video. In the next video, we'll move on to maybe performing an actual move and looking at some of the animations and transitions there. Thank you for watching.